Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 2 of Intersections, Mission to Innovate. I'm Gracie Davidson and joined with me is Kuan Collins and Prachi here at the Spark Studio. In a world that is increasingly complex, a together is better mindset is required across all disciplines to create a seamless and connected innovation ecosystem that drives agility, adaptability, trust, and transparency. It's critical for all organizations to understand and achieve high quality collaboration and ultimately a culture innovation. In this episode, Kuan and Prachi are discussing intra-organizational collaboration, the different structures, examples, advice, and much more. Hello, Prachi. Hello, Kuan. Glad to be back. Welcome to episode 2 of Intersections. How are y'all?
We're doing great, Gracie. How are you?
I'm doing well. Let's get started. I'm just going to go ahead and kick it off to you, Kuan.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Kuan and Prachi again to share our ideas around innovation and helping the community and organizations with figuring this culture of innovation and collaboration out. So last session, we talked about inter-organizational collaboration. And just quickly to just summarize what we talked about, it was structures like partnerships, research, labs and accelerators, publishing, going to conferences, mostly things that you do external to your organization. So on today's episode, we're going to cover intra-organizational collaboration. Some of those structures might apply, but it's sort of a different perspective on this topic of innovation. So I'll start it off with just a little bit about just Prachi and I talking about the difference between inter and intra-organizational collaboration and why intra-organizational collaboration is important to focus on. So Prachi, you want to kick us off here?
Absolutely. Hey, happy to be back here on Intersections. Let's get the party started. So yeah, when we talk about intra-organizational collaboration, meaning what is possible within one organization or could be a large business unit of a company, I feel like, Kuan, there is already a defined mission and there are a set of leaders and hopefully their roles very well defined. And so how great and exciting is that there is already this fertile ground for awesome collaboration and great things to happen, right? And we've been talking about cafes and all of that in episode 1. And to extend that analogy a little bit, like think of a nice table in a cafe where everything is nicely laid out and we are waiting for the finer French pastries or something to arrive, right? And in some sense, I feel like the leaders of an organization can truly drive this collaboration through a top-down advocacy and putting enough thought there. And maybe I'm a bit of an idealist here, but in my head, at least, intra-organizational collaboration has to be simpler, right? Than trying to make all of this work across different organizations. So that's my quick thought. What do you think?
So Prachi, I love the way you've laid it out, because you're right. All the conditions are set for innovation and collaboration to thrive, because theoretically, right, we have the leadership, we have the roles and responsibilities defined, like you said, and that higher purpose, right? Higher moral purpose that we're all trying to achieve. What I've noticed, though, that in a lot of cases, intra-organizational collaboration is actually harder. I think the reasons for that I have examined have to do with a lot of things. One is the existing culture of the organization. If that kind of innovation and collaboration hasn't already been thriving, right, it's almost harder to now change that culture, because as we know, right, cultural change takes time, and it does take sort of that awareness of the entire organization to realize that it's not working the way we want it to work.
Right.
So I think there's some aspects of that we'll examine, as we get into this. But structure and then size, right? So the way, like, if you're very command and control already, that sort of hampers a little bit of your intra-organizational collaboration. And then if you're also a very large company, right, you have sort of the challenges associated with size.
Right. And culture, as you noted last time, eats strategy for breakfast, right?
It does, yes.
So there is that. And you are right. I mean, that raises actually a lot of questions, at least in my head. It's like, what is the role of collaboration within an organization? Like, towards what objectives specifically? And that also, I guess, is defined by what kind of organization you are, meaning not just the structure and size, but are you like a products organization versus services, right? And even within that, it's almost that mind map, right? Like, what type of services? To me, I think another important question is, what is the role of people in your organization? right? Like, are you selling their expertise to customers? Well, then they better know how to collaborate with their customers first, right? So all these different things, I think they have to be thought of. And there is almost a blueprint here, which is kind of what we are trying to get to.
Exactly.
So as we think of this, Kuan, last time, I think we talked much in depth around specific collaboration structures from an inter-organizational perspective. And I know that there is a long laundry list, especially when it comes to intra-organizational collaboration. So what are some of your favorite ones?
So when we talked about the inter-organizational collaboration, we talked about this idea of having space, right, to do experimentation and testing and prototyping. So I think from an intra-organizational perspective, that is important as well. Because you want that sort of design lab, right, space, maker space, where employees and your stakeholders in the organization have that ability to go in and ideate and play and think about new ideas and let that creativity flow. Brown bags are also great, right, where we're sharing what we're working on, we're sharing the ideas that we have. Demo days, so showcasing either the product or the service that we're trying to deliver. And then finally, reverse pitch events or pitch events, right? So this is the idea of like sort of gamifying this innovation concept, right? Where we're going into the community and we're either telling them, here are the problems that I'm trying to solve and I want your ideas to, come back to me and tell me what solutions we potentially have, or the reverse, where I have the solution, what potential problems could I solve with this? So those are some of my thoughts and favorite ways of doing things intra-organizationally.
Right. No, I love the reverse pitch, especially when you lead with problems, right, versus solutions. I think that's very important. In that same vein, I would say that hackathons and innovation challenges sort of fit right that structure, very popular ones. And I've participated and organized a bunch of them. But another one which might not be very intuitive, and this shifts the focus to employees. And there is like a talent development aspect to that almost, is a mentor and protege relationship, right? Like oftentimes it's seen as perhaps a one-way street. But I truly think that in a way it's actually perfect collaboration, because it helps the mentors and it helps the organization as a whole. Succession planning fits into sort of that same structure. Another one I think is giving voice and a forum to younger professionals, to high potential employees and emerging leaders, and kind of bringing them together, right, in one stage. In my very earlier career with SAIC, which was an employee-owned culture, actually, I was very much part of that cohort. And it was a very motivating and a very, very warm experience. So I know we could keep going, but Kuan, what are some others that you have observed?
So I think training is important, especially with an organization that maybe has this challenge of organizational change, right? Where they're not already doing innovation and collaboration, and they need sort of the tools, right? What are those mechanisms that we can use, such as Agile and DevSecOps? And, Agile not only applied to software development, but program management, and just the way that we communicate about things that we need, the problems that we're trying to solve, and the solutions that we want to bring to try to investigate a solution for that problem. So I think training is critical. And then having sort of that, I think that goes hand in hand with the training, that psychological safety where it's okay to make a mistake, right? It's okay, it's safe to fail, right? And that this is all about learning. And what goes with that psychological safety, is that you can give very clear feedback, right? So that as you are doing the things you're doing and, perhaps it doesn't go the way you're planning it, to be able to get that feedback from your internal stakeholders to say, here's how I would do things differently. And just to have that as a natural way of doing business.
Right.
And I also think, I love, sort of the Google model where employees have the time. So I think in your example with the SAIC environments that you were in while you were here, we have those, but it's not always a funded event, right? It becomes an external duty. And then that doesn't give you sort of the latitude to spend your work time to really get that to be nurtured, right? That culture to be nurtured. Great when we have the time, but then all the things that are funded are the ones that take priority. So those are some of the things that I would add to different structures within the organization. How about you, Prachi? Any more?
And that whole, fellowships exercise, at SAIC was really great. I agree that is potentially like its own different style. Some of of my good friends and connections are through that, right? I hope you all are listening to this podcast. For me, in the recent years, I experimented and launched a few others that I think are very important if we are trying to achieve certain scale within a large organization. And that's centers of excellence. And that's different from like an intra-organizational network, which is a community of practice, right? Like that's one of my pet peeves. It's like, let's just all please agree and understand that these two are different things. And we can talk about that, maybe a topic for another day. And then along with that, as part of that center of excellence, there is a construct around citizen developers. Where these are not necessarily highly technologically oriented employees, but they have enough energy, enough interest, and they can learn some simpler technology tools and scale the innovation across the company through that. It works really wonderfully. I think that pretty much maybe covers, I think, our list. I'm sure there are a few others we could go on talking about.
Right. And I know we'll go through more examples as we dive deeper, but what's an example of an inter-organizational structure that you were involved in or launched? And then tell me some, like sort of what those lessons learned were from that engagement.
Yeah. And since I kind of started pulling this thread around the Center of Excellence and citizen developer cohort, right? Let me talk a little bit about that. The whole purpose and the reason why we started that was to bring standardization and governance on one hand, but then on the other hand, like I said, scale through those cohorts, right? Because that becomes really a low investment way to scale in a larger organization, as well as on the flip side of that, use that as a mechanism for talent development. So it had all these different facets, but I can tell you that my biggest revelation was that how much of this COE or Center of Excellence effort is not about the actual technology for which we launched the COE, right? If that makes sense. And just to kind of give it some color, having done this twice now, I can tell you that this was more about defining the purpose, communicating that sideways, down and up, defining the processes, keeping the energy levels high, right, for the COE leads and other supporting roles, and then even thinking of incentivization. Like to your point earlier, why would large number of employees stand behind this? It's almost like a movement, right? When you are trying to be that change agent, this is a new thing, this is a new way. So looking at that became really important. And the other thing I would say, so for example, now we are almost thinking of looking at additional champions from different parts of the business. And I think that's important. I would say that at the end of the day, you kind of have to start somewhere. You have to experiment, maybe tweak it as you go. And you and I, we know that we can keep talking about this all day long, but there is no 100% defined recipe for this, right? So my short message to our listeners, like if you are launching this initiative, is to be prepared for this and be prepared for the long game. And my message, right, to the sponsors or stakeholders in an organization who may be in a position of authority actually, is to learn from the lessons of other organizations or sister business units or whatever, and see how you can accelerate some of this, because you don't want to make it too hard. You don't want to always, have to start from scratch. Because I can tell you, and I know I'm being a little passionate about this now, is that there are days when I feel like we, and I mean the collective we don't have that kind of time or money to keep spending on this, right? There are important problems to solve. There are missions to take care of. So let's go. And at least that's my attitude. What about you, Kuan?
Yeah, I love your thoughts on, start where you are, right? I think that goes a lot hand in hand with some of the methodologies that we've talked about. And then that goes to, it doesn't have to be sort of this big bang event. And we can think about, what activities are already occurring in your organization that you can build off of, right? But don't, like you were saying, don't wait until you have everything figured out to get this started. And definitely pitch that message, right? That this is an important thing for us to be figuring out, because in the long term, this is what's going to bring that growth, the retention of your employees, the recruiting of new employees to your organization and your community. Some engagements that I've been involved in are like around internal software factories or internal innovation factories, design labs. So back to what we were talking about with design labs, that space where employees can go and just, not have to be bounded by any particular idea or problem or project. And then demo days. I think, when you're planning for those types of events, what I've observed is that there is sort of that renewed energy that comes from that. There's, it's like a team sport. We don't always in the work that we do, right? It's always so focused on getting the deliverable done, getting the product done, and delivering to your customer. And so this is sort of internally focused, right, on your own organization. And you get to engage with your fellow colleagues in ways that you don't normally do on a day-to-day basis. So
a little espresso shot in our coffees, maybe.
Exactly. So I think that those opportunities are so important to invest in. Like you were saying, think about those ways that you can generate that kind of energy and excitement around what we're doing. And then look at it as opportunities for upskilling your workforce. I think one example I've seen too is with Army Futures Command, right? So they've established their software factory with the intent to upskill their own soldiers, right? So that the soldiers can become part of the solution because they're getting trained in these software development methodologies and helping to ideate and get the product done. And it's been amazing to observe what that's done for the Army.
I also think that whole factory term kind of fits. I mean, initially I used to wonder about that, but the more I did this, there is a certain repeatability. It's almost like a pattern extraction exercise. And I know I'm geeking out here, but the more you do it, you kind of see those patterns and you are like, well, I don't want to make these same mistakes next time around. Or I want to utilize these, 2 or 3 key levers or key principles. And it's always, at least in my head, this little bit of optimization exercise, right? Because you are watching those patterns and you are baking that, not to go back to cafes again, but you are really baking that repeatability in your process. So anything else, Kuan?
So back to the factories, I think more than just the repeatability, I think it also drives outcomes, right? Because we want this to be something that gets to that better product, that better service, that better engagement. So I think that's sort of what I think of when I think of factory, is that it's more than just the idea getting to the end, right?
It's
and
the execution.
Outcome. Yeah, exactly.
And so I know that we just said that there is no defined 100% awesome recipe for all of this, but we do know that there are some key roles and some key ingredients or drivers within an organization, right, that are required for fostering this type of environment, for fostering this type of innovation. Let's talk a little bit about what is needed to make success.
Oh, that's a great question. So, we talked about training, right? So I think a lot of organizations, especially if they're not already there, the first question is, how do we do this? So there's several methodologies that are out there for innovation adoption. Touched on a couple of them, but like agile or scaled agile development. And when I say these, I think typically there's this perception that this only applies to software, but it really does apply to the full scale of the work that you're doing, from planning your project, managing your project, to delivering the product at the end of the day. And there's so many sort of tools within Scaled Agile, right? Like the PI planning, the program and increment planning, the retrospectives. So there's very prescribed ways that it shows an employee or a team how to engage with each other so that you're sharing ideas, you're giving each other feedback, and you're collaborating appropriately. DevSecOps is sort of that umbrella term that talks about this culture that we want within the organizations. So again, it is more than just the tools and the techniques. It's about how do we engage in a way where we're cross-skilling, right? So your developer understands your security, understands what operations is doing, such that when they're doing their development, right, it's already taking into account how I'm going to transition this to make sure it's secure, how I'm going to transition this so that operationally we don't break anything. And then finally, from an IT perspective, right, there's ITIL version 4 that has incorporated Agile and DevSecOps, right, to help you with executing these IT projects in that kind of environment where you're automating and you're communicating regularly. And it's very interesting to see all of these methodologies focused on this idea of culture of collaboration and the culture of innovation and what's needed in order for us to do this work. So there's been a shift, right? Because especially with what we see in IT, from the very tactical, here's how to, implement your cloud, to this is more about how are we communicating with each other about what we want to do with the cloud.
Right.
And then, ingredients in terms of your organization. So I did my dissertation actually on intra-organizational collaboration, and I studied several factors. So it was leadership, organizational culture, structure, knowledge management. And with knowledge management was this ease of sharing and transferring your knowledge. So not so much just about having a repository, but how easy is it for me to actually share information with you? And do I know where that information resides, right? Is it in my head or is it somewhere else? And then finally, this idea of organizational trust, which I know we'll talk a little bit further down, but, this idea that we feel, I think, psychologically safe within an organization, and that I'm gifting this collaboration with you. I'm gifting the sharing of information with my colleagues, with my team. And there isn't sort of that sense that I need to, sort of keep this to myself because it somehow makes me have more significance in the organization, if that makes sense. How about you, Prachi? Tell me about like some roles that we need to think about when we're prioritizing innovation and collaboration.
Sure. You sort of stirred something there for me. Like I feel that aspect around knowledge management and sharing is so intricately tied with the trust part, right? Like if you don't have the trust, the knowledge sharing is not going to happen.
Exactly.
So I love some of those points. I think your dissertation should be a mandatory reading for our audience. But yeah, switching gears to some of the roles, I actually recently wrote an article on democratization of technology, right? And I love that term, democratization. There is, it can be applied in all different contexts, but what that really refers to is how this is not a silo, how technology or technology-oriented implementations, innovation is not a silo, but can be really thought of as different roles within an organization where everyone is playing to their strengths, right? Like this is not about taking a particular individual and turning them around and like giving a whatever innovation makeup or makeover, right? To me, the different roles I think you absolutely kind of need someone in a lead position. They, like we were discussing, become almost a change agent. They need to have a lot of energy. But then back to what you were saying, I think this is really about going from tactical to strategic thinking, right? So they need to have an element of that. They need to be able to set and communicate that vision. Apart from that, then obviously you need the executors, the doers. I feel like some people are great thinkers, right? They are able to do deep thinking. They might not be so much of an executor, but they are the thinkers. So great. Let's identify their strengths and let's give them a platform to do that. I've noticed that, when we started centers of excellence and things like that, some people, not only do they love to learn those things, they love to be in a trainer position, right? So great. Let's identify that skill and let's give them the platform to do that. And then finally, one of my favorite terms, I use that a lot, is co-creator. And what that really means is that you are maybe a little bit more on the domain or the business side, but you are bringing all of that domain expertise to really build something together. It's a very common term on the design thinking side, and we talked about that last time. But ultimately, I think, all of this talked about, it needs to be made a priority within the organization, right? These roles can just be something that are only in our heads, or there is no sort of backing behind it. And one of the exec leadership roles here is a title that's become a little bit popular in the last several years, is a Chief Innovation Officer. And while it's not a mainstream role, I think yet, right, I think it needs to be thought of. And the reason is because, of course, in an organization, you might have other roles like a CIO or a CTO or a Chief Growth Officer, but they have to operate within certain constraints. That's not the same as a Chief Innovation or a Chief Transformation Officer. So by definition, there are some roles that are more risk averse, right? By profile, that's their job. So in my head, there is almost this ping pong between these innovation folks and maybe the CIOs of the world. And it actually provides a really nice balance to an organization.
I completely agree with that. I think that there's, I've often heard too of like a evangelist role, like a chief evangelist role. So that's another title I've always thought would be fun to have. But I think the other thing, to your point, with that balance, organizations need to get comfortable with having a little bit of that conflict, if you will, right? Because those two roles would be in conflict with each other, but you can have conflict and still thrive in this culture of innovation. You almost need that conflict because you need sort of that tension,
Exactly.
right? That sort of produces the outcome that you're looking for. Other areas, I think, ingredients that are required are funding. So we mentioned, this idea that this can't be just a side duty, right? This can't be a thing that we expect to just happen because we all agree it's a good idea. There needs to be focus, budget, and this pipeline. In the same way that we manage the pipeline of work for our customers, for growth, there needs to be this recognition that this idea of innovation and creating that culture is what supports all of those things, right? Your growth and your, executing with this idea of you're innovating and bringing your customers the best and the most innovative ideas possible. So I think that's a critical area that we don't always focus on in our organizations.
Right. No, completely agree with that. In fact, I would say that probably all have witnessed a lot of what I call half-baked efforts. Maybe, something was missing, some piece of that puzzle was missing. Oftentimes it's the advocacy, sometimes it's the funding. And so I really feel that, look, we have to pull through to completion, right? Some of these efforts. Otherwise, what's the point? And
Right.
I would say that not only then do we have to think about all of these different ingredients, but then also start small and iterate. I mean, again, that goes back to some of the agile principles that you were referring to. But my heart just sinks when we look at some of these efforts and a lot of energy, thought, and momentum. And then it's just like, okay, gone, funding is stopped, or whatever it is, right? And then how often do we do a little bit of a postmortem to say what went wrong and not repeat those mistakes? Because I think that's also a key during an organization's journey.
Absolutely. So, what is your collaboration style, Prachi, when it comes to intra-organizational collaboration?
Well, now that you ask one, I have to say that my collaboration style, is same as my leadership style. And what I mean by that is that, I lean towards making things outcome based. I tend to think of why, why we are doing what we are doing a lot, and whether that applies to all my leadership activities or collaboration. I don't exactly separate the two. The other thing I feel strongly about is that the collaboration needs to have an alignment, especially within an organizational construct, to that organization's core values and objectives. Right. And on one hand, you have your core values, objectives, and then if you pull that thread further, there is an aspect of how you are branding externally and what your message to your stakeholders is. And I feel like the collaboration piece just kind of has to flow through all of that and kind of align with all of that. And finally, I feel like all of this has to have an element of fun, right? When people are in the flow, when they are enjoying what they're doing, when they're working together, that's when some of the really awesome things happen. So those are some of the things I feel really passionate about, and I try to introduce that through my work. And I know, Kuan, you and I, resonate on a lot of those things.
Oh, absolutely. And I love your point about flow. I think that feeds a little bit as a teaser into our next episode on this idea of mindfulness, right? And I think from my perspective, my collaboration style definitely is intrinsic to myself, to how I lead, to how I engage with others. And it does require a sort of a management of myself, right? To make sure that I'm doing all the right things to be open to that, be open to the collaboration, be open to that trust of my colleagues. And that mindfulness and meditation practice is important to me. In my dissertation, I talked about this idea of high quality collaboration. And I defined that as collaboration that leads to a better service, process, or product. We can collaborate a lot, right? We can meet all day long. We can be in these conferences, but we know the difference between just being together and actually engaging, right? There's a difference, and we walk away with it with a different feeling, because that collaboration that we're talking about needs to be tied into what you mentioned, Prachi, with that passion, right? You have to be engaged. You have to like what you're doing, enjoy your job, right? Enjoy the work that you're doing in order for that magic to happen. Going back to that gift culture, right, in terms of how I practice, I mean, I consciously think about, what I'm doing and making sure that I am gifting my knowledge, my experience, what I'm trying to do with my colleague and my teams. And then back to, I think you mentioned this too, being hyper focused on what is the problem that we're trying to solve, right? That we're not just doing this because it's cool, right? I mean, although it is, but that we are trying to bring value to the things that we are trying to accomplish, to the problems that we're trying to solve. And that to me is, again, the success factor. That's when we know we're doing something good.
I have to say, I even love that phrase that you just used, the gift culture, right? We have to talk more about that. But right now, I can tell you, you've sold me on that phrase. So I know we've been talking a lot on all kinds of different things here around intra-organizational collaboration. As we sort of start wrapping this a little bit, what advice, Kuan, would you give to some of our young professionals out there about how to best leverage intra-organizational collaboration structures, keeping in mind their career, their professional, and also personal growth in mind?
Such a great question. So I think about it from the context of impact. At the end of the day, we all want to have impact, right, on our relationships, on our organizations, on our community, with our customers. And so in a conference that I went to, there was Dean of the College of Business at Oxford University gave a framework for impact. And it was around social capital, intellectual capital, and reputation capital. And this all ties into, and I promise I'll bring it all together. So social capital speaks to your network. So when you think about it in the context of your intra-organization, right, you want to have a network of people within your organization. And that can happen through your centers of excellence, through your communities of practice, through those structures that we talked about, right, when you're going to demo days or what have you. So you need that network, and it's important to nurture those relationships when you are engaged in those groups. Your reputation capital now speaks to sort of what does that network, how do they perceive you and your contributions? And that then ties into your intellectual capital. At the end of the day, those three ingredients, your intellectual capital is what you are bringing, right? Your skills, your experience, your knowledge. And that's critical, right? Because you need to be involved as an equal partner with everybody else that's involved in that engagement. And so when you have those three together, then, that magic that we were talking about comes into play. You're engaged, you have this community, and you're contributing as well as receiving from others. So I would really like, my advice then at the end of the day is focus on the thing that you love, right? Build on that skill and that experience around, and then find your community to engage with so that you can start to build that network of people that care about the thing that you care about. And once you have those ingredients, then, the rest will sort of come together.
Right. No, I love how you laid that out. And I would extend that to say that, look, all of this does require some efforts, right? It's not something that comes easy, but put the efforts to think about this. Like, I started thinking about this only midway through my career, right? I'll say it. But I know that the next generation actually is much more engaged, much more aware of everything around them, much more purposeful, if I can use that term. And I feel that there are just such vast opportunities to shape what you can do. And you don't have to try to do it. You can just pick a few things, participate in, use that framework, and then think of the next leap. Right. And then back to my favorite line, I'll say it again, just have fun doing that. Finally, I would also say, Kuan, is that my message to some of the younger professionals, and again, I don't think we are trying to be condescending or whatever, but it's just something we are so passionate about, is that don't undersell yourself, right? Don't think like your voice doesn't matter, because it absolutely does. And I truly, truly believe that wisdom and ideas can come from any place and any age. So over to you, Kuan.
Well, I love that point because I think you're absolutely right? I think the dynamic has changed, right? Where that experience and that engagement needs to come from all levels of your organization, especially our young people, because that's where a lot of the new ideas are getting born. So thank you, Prachi, for this wonderful conversation in our second episode of Intersections Intersections. It's been so much fun to spend time, talk with you. And looking forward, our next episode is going to be around why innovations fail, challenges, pitfalls, and path to success. So it'll extend a lot of what we've talked about here. And we'll also integrate some of what we've touched on in terms of mindfulness and the importance of focusing on how you are presenting yourself in these engagements and the impact that has on the collaboration engagement. And I'd like to thank the Invention to Innovation Center at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, and to Jack and Gracie for being our producers today. We look forward to talking to you next month.
Go Team Intersections.
Thank you, Kuan and Prachi, for another great discussion. I have enjoyed this topic very much, hearing about the advice they would give to young professionals. I'm looking forward to episode 3. Follow all our socials to make sure you don't miss an episode at UAH I2C.